Let's dive into a topic that's hotter than a Durban curry and more intense than a Blue Bulls versus Stormers match. We're talking about the recent hulabaloo between the United States and South Africa, a diplomatic spat that's got everyone from Pretoria to Washington, D.C. buzzing. Imagine this, to put you on game real quick. You're at a braai, everyone's having a good time, the boerewors is sizzling, and suddenly your neighbor who's been generously supplying the drinks for the party and the braai decides to cut you off. Why, you ask? Because you've been making some questionable decisions that affected the entire neighborhood. Now replace that neighbor with the United States, the drinks, replace it with the substantial financial aid, and replace the questionable decisions with South Africa's land expropriation on without compensation policy. Feeling the heat yet? Because recently, President Donald Trump announced plans to halt US funding to South Africa, citing concerns over the country's new land expropriation law. This law allows the government to seize land without compensating the owners, aiming to address historical injustices from the apartheid era. While this intention might sound as noble as ever, the execution has raised eyebrows both literally and figuratively. To those who are not in the loop, I want to break it down for you. South Africa's history is marinated with land expropriation, where the black population was systematically stripped off of their rights. Fast forward to today, and the government under Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, he has introduced or reintroduced that expropriation act for that matter. Now this permits the state to take ownership of land without compensation, intending to rectify past wrongs and promote equitable land distribution. I hope you understand. However, this hasn't been without controversy because critics argue that such a policy could deter foreign investment, destabilize the economy, and lead to a decline in agricultural productivity. The United States, a significant donor to South Africa, especially in sectors like healthcare, has expressed its disapproval. President Trump, echoing concerns from figures like Elon Musk, has labeled the policy as a massive human rights violation against white farmers and has threatened to cut financial aid to the nation. Now, before you brand me as a sellout or accuse me of siding with imperialists, hear me out for a second. The United States has been a substantial benefactor to South Africa. Big benefactor, pouring billions into various sectors over 30 years. Most notably healthcare. Programs like PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, have been instrumental in combating HIV/AIDS in our country. Cutting these funds could have dire consequences for the millions in this country who rely on such services. That's a no-brainer. Now I want to get to the bottom of this matter. Land expropriation without compensation. On paper, it sounds like a swift solution to solve historical injustices, doesn't it? But in reality, it's a Pandora's box. And here's why. Potential for abuse in this is astronomical. Given the ANC's track record, can we honestly trust them to handle this responsibly? Or are we just handing over more resources for them to mismanage and loot?
Donald Trump must leave us alone. He must leave us alone, Kauri. When we were facing apartheid, when we were facing oppression, he was not here. He did not fight side by side with us. And we were able, on our own, yes, with support of progressive forces in the world, to resolve the apartheid question. As far as I recall, Donald Trump was not around the negotiating table when we negotiated the end of apartheid. So stick around there in the White House. We will do our business here and we will find solutions for our problems. So stay out of our issues and we will not get involved in your issues in America.
Now, Cyril, I'm going to say this in the most British way I possibly can, mate. What the bloody hell do you think you're doing? Also, now that you're in BRICS, you can bite every other hand that feeds you that isn't in BRICS, mate. Do we need to get you in the ring with Dreykus Duplessis to get your senses back in that big head of yours? That entitled big head of yours? Where's your brain at? Down your middle toe? Let's dissect this policy further. Basically, the idea is to take land from those who have too much and give it to those who have none. It's noble, isn't it? But who decides who has too much? The government? The same government that can't keep the lights on, can't provide clean water, and has turned state-owned enterprises into personal piggy banks? And let's not forget the potential for corruption. What's stopping officials from expropriating prime real estate and handing it over to their cronies? You tell me, because we sure as hell have seen that before. This isn't land reform. This is legalized theft. Think about the message this sends to investors. Come to South Africa, where your assets can be seized in a whim. Sounds like a great investment opportunity, doesn't it? This policy could trigger capital flight, deter foreign investment, and plunge our already fragile economy into even deeper turmoil. Agriculture, a sector that employs millions and feeds the nation, could be decimated. Commercial farmers, fearing expropriation, might cut back on production or abandon all their farms altogether. This isn't speculation from summer. This is a probable outcome, I'm telling you. Now let's talk about healthcare, because the US has been a major contributor to South Africa's health sector, especially in the fight against HIV and AIDS. Cutting these funds could lead to a resurgence of the epidemic, undoing years of progress. This is the price we're willing to pay for a poorly thought out policy? Aye man. Let's not spare anyone here. The ANC, with its cadre deployment and nepotism, has shown time and time again that it's more interested in lining its pockets than serving the people. And now this land without expropriation policy, with that they are playing a dangerous game with our nation's future. And to the EFF, with your fiery rhetoric and populist promises, do you really think this policy will uplift the masses? Or are you just stoking the flames for political gain and popularity and attention? Joining BRICS doesn't mean we can alienate traditional allies. China and Russia aren't going to bail us out when things go south. They have their own stresses and they have their own interests, not ours. Biting the hand that feeds us, especially when that hand has been as generous as the US, is not just ungrateful, it's suicidal. Land reform is necessary, but it must be done responsibly. We need clear policies, transparency, and a commitment to justice, not vengeance. Let's focus on empowering emerging farmers, providing them with the skills and the resources they actually need to succeed, rather than seizing land and hoping for the best, because if we do that, Mandela will turn in his grave, because this is exactly what he did not want. In conclusion, this land expropriation policy is a disaster waiting to happen. It's a populist move that ignores economic realities and jeopardizes this nation's future. You need to think carefully about the path you're in and consider the long-term consequences of your actions. Because once the land is taken and the aid is cut, there might be no turning back. It's essential to recognize that while the intention behind land expropriation is to address historical injustices, the method of implementation is just as crucial. A hasty or poorly planned approach to this can lead to unintended consequences that will worsen the very issues it seeks to resolve. Property rights are a cornerstone of any stable economy. Undermining these rights can lead to a loss of confidence among both local and international investors. If businesses fear that their assets can be seized without compensation, then they are less likely to invest, less likely to expand, or even maintain their operations within the country. This can lead to more job losses, reduced economic activity, and a decline in the overall standard of living. We don't even have to look far to see what happens when land reform is handled recklessly. Zimbabwe tried the exact same nonsense in the early 2000s under Robert Mugabe. Farms were forcibly seized from white owners and redistributed. Sounds fair, right? Well, guess what happens next? The country went from being the breadbasket of Africa to the basket case of Africa almost overnight. Agricultural output collapsed. Food shortages became rampant, inflation spiraled out of control, and I'm talking trillion-dollar notes that couldn't even buy bread. And millions of Zimbabweans fled to neighboring countries, many to South Africa, a country that's facing the same downfall as we know it. Now tell me, Cyril, do you want a repeat of that disaster? Because that's exactly where we're headed if you carry on like this. And unlike Zimbabwe, South Africa doesn't have the same level of minerals and resources to recover as easily. Even the ANC's own Minister of Agriculture admitted that more than 90% of land reform projects in South Africa have failed. That's right, 9 out of 10 farms handed to new owners under the land reform program collapsed due to lack of skills, resources, or just pure corruption. So why should we trust the government with even more land when they've already shown they have zero ability to manage it? Educate me. Let me tell you something, Cyril. So you think because you joined BRICS, you can start burning bridges with the West? You think China and Russia are suddenly going to be our new friends, handing us billions with no strings attached? Wake up, King! China and Russia have their own stresses where they are. The last thing they need to hear is an entitled South Africa telling them, the USA cut their funding to us, but screw them, you guys can fund us, right? Russia can barely sustain its own economy with all the sanctions against it. And China doesn't do charity. It does debt traps. They'll lend you billions, then when you can't pay it back, they'll start seizing your assets. Look what happened to Zambia. China built their infrastructure, and when Zambia defaulted, guess who now controls key parts of their economy? This idea that we don't need the West is the most delusional nonsense the ANC has ever made you believe. America and Europe are still the biggest investors in South Africa, and cutting ties with them is like telling your boss to footsack after you've secured a new job. And let's not forget, America wasn't just funding random projects here. They were funding key sectors like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Do you think China is going to take over and fund ARV programs for millions of South Africans? Do you think Russia cares about funding South African schools and hospitals? If you truly believe that, Cyril, then you've got a higher chance of seeing Eskom actually keep the lights on than of China stepping in out of kindness. Because here's why land expropriation is a disaster waiting to happen. Number one, investor confidence will collapse in South Africa. South Africa is already an investor confidence problem thanks to corruption, crime, and a government that's completely incompetent. Land expropriation without compensation is forced, then the foreign investors will flee faster than an ANC politician caught with his hands in the cookie jar. Number two is that the people who get the land won't even benefit, because the government is selling this as a giving land to the people. But let's be real. Who is really going to get the land? The poor struggling farmer who wants to build a better future? Or the ANC elite who will board prime land for themselves while telling the rest of us to stay in the townships? Number three is because commercial agriculture will be destroyed if this is done. South Africa relies on commercial farming to feed its people. When experienced farmers leave or shut down their operations, we'll see massive food shortages, skyrocketing prices, and a reliance on more expensive food imports. Number four is SA's economy will be crippled. Agriculture is a major contribution to South Africa's GDP. If farms collapse, jobs are lost, and food production dwindles, we'll be staring down the barrel of economic disaster. And by the way, Cyril, I want to talk to you about another sector America was funding: education. You know, the thing that 80% of South African grade 4 students can't even succeed at? Yep, that's right. According to the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study, PEARLS for short, 8 out of 10 South African grade 4s can't read for meaning in any language, let alone read. These are the same kids who will soon become adults and enter a workforce where they can't even understand basic instructions. But sure, let's go ahead and piss off a very strong America so they can pull even more funding from education. Maybe then we'll get to 100% literacy. And it's not just reading our grade 4s are bad at. Our math and science rankings are among the worst in the world. Public schools in South Africa have turned into playgrounds of crime, drugs, and teenage pregnancies. Parents who can afford to send their kids to private schools are doing so in droves because no one trusts the government schools anymore. It's not rocket science here. Let's be real. The ANC elite and politicians will never send their kids to public schools or rely on state-run hospitals. They all send their kids to expensive private schools overseas and fly to Europe or Dubai when they need medical treatment. They live in mansions protected by maximum security while telling the rest of us to deal with the consequences of their terrible decisions. At some point, you need to stop blaming colonialism, apartheid, and the Togoloshi. We need to admit that South Africa's biggest problem is the people in power today. Crime is out of control, but criminals get released early while law-abiding citizens are left to fend for themselves. Corruption is rampant. Billions go missing every year, yet no one ever gets arrested. ESCOM is a disaster, but ANC cadres keep getting jobs despite their incompetence. Education is failing, but we keep voting for the same people who've been running the schools to the damn ground. Cyril, do you really think this country can afford to lose US funding over a policy that will only benefit corrupt politicians and destroy our economy as we know it? Is this really the hill you want to die on? At this rate, South Africa isn't just biting the hand that feeds it. It's gnawing its entire arm off. If we really want to fix land inequality in South Africa, here's a crazy idea from Summer Sambit. Do it properly. Number 1, provide skills and resources to new farmers so they can actually be productive. Number 2, stop corruption so land doesn't end up in the hands of ANC politicians and their friends over and over again. Number 3, encourage investment rather than scaring it away. Number 4, use state-owned land first. There are millions of hectares of unused government land that could be distributed before we even start stealing private property. But no, that would require actual leadership and effort, wouldn't it? And we all know the ANC doesn't do either of those things. So as the Americans would say, you've made your bed, South Africa, now lie in it. And to Cyril, sort yourself out, mate, before the whole country turns into a bloody Zimbabwe 2.0.